Welcome to Your Corporate Shrink Podcast. You can engineer human and you can engineer leaders. Here on Your Corporate Shrink, join Elizabeth Frisch, a corporate fixer with a heart of gold, a wicked sense of humor, and a passion to solve pervasive business problems permanently. We will dive into the real issues and opportunities facing companies and government agencies today. Let's get started helping you engineer leaders.
All right, welcome everybody to You Can't Engineer Human. This is your host, Elizabeth Frisch. And what we promise you will get out of this podcast is something you can walk away with today, use, and have success in the workplace. So I'm really excited today to have one of my favorite people on the planet on the podcast with me. Carrie Williams has been an amazing, and I call her a facilitator. She's a best-selling author and has done a lot of work in the industry around a lot of hot topics. And we decided today that there's a really big one. It's in the conversation right now. It's in the workplace. Everybody's afraid to say what's so. And so Carrie and I thought it might be a great thing for us to address this head on, because who wants to be sitting in a boardroom, the elephant's crapping on the table, to be frank, and no one's willing to say what's so because of all the terror and fear in the workplace. So with that, Carrie, why don't you just give everybody a little bit of your background and then we'll dive into the topic.
Sure. So thank you for having me first. I'm a coach primarily. That's what I do first. I also facilitate as well. And I have written a book called Eyes on the Prize, a kick-ass guide to setting and achieving great goals, where I revamped the SMART goal system, which has been around since the 80s, and modernized it for the modern goal setter. For the record, I did use the word great before a politician took that word from me, so I kept it the same and didn't change it.
Nice. So one of the things that when I first met Carrie, we were working for one of the big four firms, and I was working on helping people with communication, and we were talking about the struggle. And Carrie said, I do this great exercise called My Baby is Ugly. And it was actually, I think more correctly, Your Baby is Ugly and How Do I Tell You? And so, Carrie, I thought maybe you could just give us a little backstory, because it's become a super powerful practice. I actually use it all the time, with credits to you, of course, for teaching it to me. And how did you come up with this?
Well, interestingly enough, it came from, I was in a boardroom and everybody knew what the problem was, and it was going to take down the company if they didn't solve this problem. And everybody knew who was creating and making the problem worse. And no one wanted to be the messenger. No one wanted to be the risk taker, to put their head out there, be honest and vulnerable, and take the risk of saying, look, this is what we all see, and now how do we fix it? And so what I've learned with working with folks and telling hard truths, especially with the younger generation, is they're not really well trained in sticky situations, in dealing with combative personalities, and in dealing with conflict. And telling someone something that is true and might hurt is kind of the epitome of conflict, right?
It is.
So I had to make it fun and explain it in a way where they would get excited. And so I created the exercise of, how do you tell someone that their baby's ugly, so that they can hear it and get it and not hate your guts when you're done?
And what I loved is you put a little twist on it, because it's so applicable to organizations in corporate America. The little twist you had of, and they're about to enter the baby in a beauty competition, and the baby is like the ugliest baby on the planet. And I remember thinking, that's so brilliant, because how many times is someone like, yeah, let's go forward with the idea, or let's go forward with this, and everybody sits around and goes, this is so gonna crash, right?
Right.
And so we end up wasting money and hours and time and resources. And so I loved that little twist too, because that's totally analogous to what happens is nobody's willing to stick their neck out because we go with the messenger, right? And so what I would love you to tell our audience is kind of some of the things like, okay, the baby is ugly. What do you say? Like, what are the things that allow you to be direct and get the result you want without having the person blow up, get defensive, everybody in the room? And then we'll even talk about, like, if you are shot for being the messenger, even if you've mastered baby is ugly, what we'll do.
Well, here's the great thing about Your Baby's Ugly it requires a lot of emotional intelligence skills to do it well. And that's something that I think that we don't give enough credit in the workplace. I don't know if you read, Google put out an article at the end of last year that I loved, where they did a 4-year study for their employees. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to figure out the 7 most important skills that successful employees used on a daily basis in Google. And they thought number 1 was going to be STEM, which is why I think this is up your alley.
Yep.
They found out that in the top 7, STEM was the lowest. It was the last. And the top 4 were all emotional intelligence skills. It was how to be a good coach, how to be supportive and empathetic to your teammates, all of those things. And those are the skills that you have to use in this exercise. Because before you can tell someone something hard, they have to trust you, and they have to understand that you have their best interest at heart. That you don't have a personal agenda, that you're not doing this for you, you're doing this for them.
Yeah. And it's interesting, in corporate America, everybody's got a personal agenda. You know, everybody's got a position, everybody's got a space and a place they're trying to hold. And so if you're doing Your Baby is Ugly, you're sitting there in a room and someone puts something on the table and you know it's just gonna not be good, where would you start that conversation? Especially you and I sit in boardrooms, right? And we sit with leadership of companies. Where would you start that conversation knowing that there's some definite emotional loading probably in the room?
Right. So I started by prefacing, aligning what I'm about to say to their core values and core beliefs and not mine, right? So I acknowledge the situation of, I understand that you're really excited about this contest and that you have hopes that your baby is going to win. And I know that it's really important to you that everyone sees how beautiful you believe your baby is, right? So that's what we're going to start. Like, there's your reality. This is where you're coming from, and that's your perspective, and I get it. However, there might be something that you're missing because your love for your baby shifts your perspective on what you see. And I want to make sure that you have all the data before you make the decision going forward. So it's a gentle but really honest conversation.
Yeah.
Because you can't just go up to someone and go, hey lady, your baby's ugly.
Right. Or put it in the contest. Sitting in the room and the director of marketing has spent, $500,000 building something, and you walk in and go, it sucks.
Right. And sometimes that's what you need to say.
Yeah.
But you need to say it in a way that you are not destroying that person, putting them on the defensive, and killing their motivation, right?
Yes.
Because we want them to then go, okay, maybe this isn't the right strategy, but I'm capable of finding the right strategy. We don't want them to just quit, which is what harsh, improper feedback can do to a person.
And it's interesting because there's been so many books put out on the toxic workplace culture. And in fact, it's funny, in my inaugural podcast, we talked about, I have a keynote I do on why we tolerate assholes in the workplace, right? And
wait, why do we?
I wish it was a short answer. It's actually a podcast topic. So if y'all are listening to this podcast, I actually, it's coming up. It's on the schedule that I riff with someone about the psychology of why we do it. And so yeah, that's a little teaser there. I didn't mean to get us off topic, but back to the baby is ugly. And so what I heard in what you said is that there was a definite acknowledgement of like their excitement, their support of all those things that made them feel like you were valuing them as an individual, right? And totally acknowledging them. But then I also heard a very clear, it was almost a very subtle shift where you say, and you may think this is the best idea in the world, but there is probably some things that are missing that we have to address. Or, we could have, and I love the word epic fail, someone taught. I learned that one in one of my board meetings, right? Of like, this was an epic fail, right? Younger board member. I think that's probably not our generation of expression, but it was a good one. Now, so then you get to the point where they're like, okay, well, what's missing? Where do you go with the conversation next?
So really what you're trying to do with the conversation is to spur some empathy on their part, to shift their perspective, to recognize that, and this is something we all struggle with, especially right now, to shift the perspective in that, oh, maybe my perspective is my truth, but it's not the truth. Mm-hmm. There are other truths out there. And that's all you're trying to do with the conversation. So it's establish, right? Here's the reality. Acknowledge their vision of the reality and their perspective. And then simply say, I just want you to have more data so you can factor it in. You're not trying to change their mind. I just want them to have all the data so they can still make the decision themselves, but to maybe make that decision with an added perspective. And I think a lot of times when we tell someone their baby is ugly, we're trying to tell them not to enter the contest, right? Mm-hmm. So we have an end result. We have an agenda. Mm-hmm.
Now that's a really interesting twist, which leads me to a couple more questions, which is, you know, what if you're sitting in the room and you're 99.9% sure it's an epic fail? So you have an agenda, right? Quote unquote, we've got an agenda in place, and you give them the data and they still want to go forward with it. Like, how would you handle that? And, you know, I'm just thinking of, I had a board meeting where we had a baby is ugly conversation, right? And there was still a strong desire to go forward anyways, even though the data said otherwise.
Okay. So then the goal is to figure out what that desire is. Mm-hmm. What is driving that desire? Is it that they don't have another answer? Is it that they're so married to this answer that they're willing to avoid the risk? Like, what is their bonus? What need are they filling by pushing this plan? Mm-hmm. Because then you can find another way to fulfill that need.
Nice. Yeah, that makes total sense in that, you know, I was just thinking of this situation. I'll be frank, there were several people on the board whose egos were highly attached to having something happen. And you're absolutely right. If I think back on how I facilitated that situation, it was an identification of need. And so we found another way for them to have that without doing something that could be detrimental to the entire organization or a particular division, or in this case, to a financial situation that wouldn't have supported them. Now, you talked about the fact, and I agree with you, we are in a time where the messenger can get shot, right? Mm-hmm. So the one who brings it up can end up being the lightning rod. So what do you do if you're in that situation? And I don't know about you, but I've been in some pretty contentious meetings between leaders of companies, boards and leaders of companies, all those places. And you see the messenger, and it could be you if you're facilitating the session, right? But you just see that crucifixion start happening. How do you shift that momentum?
So the first thing is to recognize that if you are the messenger and they turn against you, it's really hard not to do this, but work at not taking this personally. They are not attacking you. They are attacking the idea that they might be wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's hard for a lot of people. So the best thing you can do in this situation is stay calm, stay as focused on facts as you can, and stay steady. The other thing that you can do is you can get people on your side before you even step forward, right? People are more likely to listen to more than one person at a time, especially if they can all stay calm and factual. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, there are going to be some situations that you can't control where there's going to be backlash for being the messenger. And that's when you just have to be okay with it, right? There's something to be said for having the integrity and standing up for yourself and saying what's right, even if there's repercussions to it.
And it's funny, we talk about repercussions, and it was interesting because I did a couple studies with a couple of the corporations I worked with, and they had this perception that everyone who was the messenger got crucified, and in their mind they were going to get fired, right? Mm-hmm. And it was
that's the biggest fear.
Right. And what was interesting to me was this was a big Fortune 500 company. You know, I went and looked across the entire organization, and we did surveys and we looked at things. And what was fascinating, even though everyone believed that they would get fired for being the messenger, in fact, it was incredibly rare for the person. Now they might get yelled at, crucified, whatever, but when the thing, bore out that person still had their job. And sometimes not only had their job, got a promotion, got a shift. Yeah.
Statistically speaking, you are more likely to get promoted for speaking out in a proper way than you are to get fired.
Right. And so I think the lesson here to remember, everyone and our listeners, is that yes, there's this thing that, oh, the messenger gets shot. Well, guess what? I'm 25 years old in this business. Carrie's probably, and I won't rat you out either, right? How many times in your career, and I can even say mine, and I've been in front of some of the largest organizations in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And been the messenger, because what's really common is you hire a consultant or a coach to come in and deliver the bad message, right?
Right.
In my entire career, 25 years, hundreds of companies I've worked with, I have fired off of 2 projects, right? 2 projects for delivering the message.
For me, it's 1. And I knew before I delivered the message that the company probably was not ready for it. They probably weren't ready for the coaching and the change that they needed to happen. But even knowing that, I still had to give my perspective of the truth to them. Because
right.
then I'm not doing my job. People pay us to be really honest, to be really forthright, and to be really genuine, which is lucky for us because that's in our wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means we give people news that they don't necessarily want to hear. We observe things that they don't necessarily want people to see. And sometimes when we give that news, they lash back at us.
Yes. And I think the lesson here for our listeners, when you're sitting in an organizational culture and, this company that I did the survey of, it wasn't that they fired people. They actually had a public crucifixion process and meetings that they were doing. And so when we actually got to the root cause, it was like, how about we do this? Every time someone screws up and a messenger comes, we actually create a different process for addressing the breakdown. Mm-hmm. And it allowed that whole company to have a complete shift. And so one of the gifts that you as the messenger bring to an organization, right, is the ability to teach people to have integrity, to talk directly to each other, because the reason why we're down this horrible slippery slope right now as a culture and as a society is because we have abdicated our roles in being the messenger because of a fear that, statistically speaking, if you look at the data, most whistleblowers don't get fired, right?
Right.
Most whistleblowers don't suffer retaliation. And there are some that do, so we're not lying that it could happen. But Carrie, I want you to make a comment about that.
Most whistleblowers are also not alone. It is always scary to be the first, but we can see it in our culture right now. Someone comes out with something that happened to them, and then immediately other people raise their hand and say, me too. Mm-hmm. And it happens in the boardroom, and it happens everywhere. So it is a little scary to be the first one to raise your hand in the room, but it's also really empowering and really exciting because you could be the impetus of something bigger. And you don't know you're not alone until you raise your hand.
Yes. And I think one of the things for our listeners out there, because sometimes I hear that, I don't want to be the one who comes forward. And this is, hint for one of our next podcast topics. Why do we tolerate assholes in the workplace? And they can be male or female, folks, by the way. A toxic boss is not gender specific. And it has to do with that. So I love, on circling back, that one of the great training exercises you can do with your staff is literally Carrie's exercise of, how do you tell someone the baby is ugly and they want to put the baby in a beauty contest? How do you tell someone the app is terrible and they're about to go have a pitch to a VC firm? Or how do you tell someone that this change initiative or this big idea for a new product, well, guess what? Maybe the data shows it's not going to vet out. Mm-hmm. Or how do you deal with people with agendas? There's a reality in the workplace. And I love what you said about some messengers do get shot, right? And it doesn't feel good. And it's funny when we look at the psychology behind when someone's like, at you. I always remember what one of my great mentors told me, which was smile, because the minute your corners turn up, your brain stays engaged, right? Breathe, because again, the minute you stop breathing, you lose your wits. And in this society, the one who stays calm, factual, engaged in the conversation, and doesn't take offense or defense, tends to be the one that's respected and admired.
And also tends to be the one that has the most power through the situation. Mm-hmm. If you're dealing with somebody who is angry, What's the worst response you can have?
Giving them anger back and elevating the situation.
Exactly. What's the best response?
I usually smile, listen, and ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Because usually if someone's angry, even if they're screaming, I had a boss who called me the C word, right? And I did ask him, like, why do you feel that way? I was just curious because I'd never been called that before,
right.
And I think that it helps us to stay in that kind of space of, if someone's that upset, your goal should be to get to the root of it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry about what it means about you. Get to the root of it, because I get hired all the time to come in and teach root cause. And the reason why root cause is so powerful is because it takes the feelings and emotions out of it. We're just trying to get to the source so we have something clear to work on. So
So do you ever use the stop technique with your clients?
No, tell me about that.
Oh, okay. We're all about what you can take away and use in your practical life. And this is a really simple technique that you can use. If you feel yourself getting too engaged and going down that rabbit hole and you want to stop and take a moment and calm yourself down, you stop, which is stop. Mm-hmm. T stands for take a deep breath, because we know that when we take a deep breath, we relax our body and we shift our hormones. Observe what it is that is actually happening to you. What are you actually feeling, and what is the root cause of that feeling? And then figure out your course of action and proceed. That's what the P stands for. When you start this, you're probably going to do it 20 to 30 times a day in your head, but it takes about 30 seconds, and then you'll get really good at it.
Yes. And it's funny when I get pulled in, because one of the things my organization does is when the proverbial crap hits the fan, right? We come in and help them sort it out. And it's funny you say that, because the first thing we do is try to get them to breathe and calm down. Because one of the tricks is to go fast. And I can tell you, every media, PR, big, huge issue that I've ever had to come in and clean up for an organization has been because they're like, we can't wait, we gotta go, we can't stop. And guess what? Your limbic brain is really stupid. It makes really bad decisions, right? Mm-hmm. So I love that you taught the stop method on the call, and that we got to talk about all these really cool things today. So just as a quick wrap, we're going to do a quick back and forth, because I want to leave everyone. If you get off this call and you're like, okay, what am I going to have the biggest bang for the buck? Carrie, what would you tell them to try first?
Oh man, try the stop technique, because it's easy. It's the simplest thing. But then if you can, try practicing empathy, because you are a more effective messenger if you can practice empathy. And all empathy is listening, understanding the person's perspective, trying to put yourself in their shoes, and trying to understand what's important to them and not just what's important to you.
And as we have a lot of managers and leaders and people who work for them, I totally would invite you to do Carrie's The Baby is Ugly exercise as a team.
And let us know how it goes. Post under the podcast, because like I said, it's been so helpful for me, because guess what? We don't learn this crap in college, folks. This is called real life. So go out, don't be afraid as a leader to try this and have people play in it, because it's a nice situation to just really get people going, and yourself. Because I would love to say I was brilliant at giving feedback when I started out, and no, took me a little bit of time. Now I have this visual of everyone going to Walmart and walking up to people and going, your baby's ugly. Your baby's really ugly. Maybe don't practice that way.
No, don't practice that way. Close yourself in a conference room and have a really good team building time. All right. Well, thank you so much, Carrie, for joining my call today. Hope you all enjoyed the call. Remember, you can find both of us if you want to talk to either of us on yourcorporateshrink.com. And looking forward to seeing you all on the next podcast. Have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Your Corporate Shrink podcast. You can engineer human, and you can engineer leaders. With your host, Elizabeth Frisch. Find Elizabeth and her team at yourcorporateshrink.com.